The courtroom was silent, dense with a tension so heavy it seemed almost alive. Every breath, every shuffle of a paper, every shift in a wooden pew felt amplified against the vast marble walls. And into that suffocating stillness walked Camille Lawson, a black woman dressed impeccably in a midnight blue suit that was cut to perfection, her posture betraying neither doubt nor hesitation. She knew she belonged there. She had worked her whole life to be exactly where she stood now, inside courtroom 4B of the St. Louis Federal Courthouse, holding the evidence that could unravel years of hidden corruption. But sometimes, even belonging is not enough. At the checkpoint, before she could reach the courtroom doors, a police officer, Sergeant Travis Whitmore, a man whose face was hardened by years of unchecked authority, stepped into her path. His pale blue eyes scanned her not with curiosity, but with contempt. Camille lifted her badge with a firm, practiced hand, allowing him a clear view of her federal credentials. Whitmore sneered. "This is fake," he barked, not even glancing properly at the badge before reaching out and snatching it from her hand. His fingers were rough, his grip unnecessary. "You don't belong here," he growled. Without further warning, he twisted Camille's arm behind her back, snapping handcuffs onto her wrists with a cruelty that drew gasps from those who had witnessed it. The metallic click of the cuffs echoed off the marble, slicing through the heavy quiet. Lawyers paused mid-conversation. Reporters froze mid-scribble. Even the judge, seated already behind the bench, looked up in alarm. Camille remained silent, her cheek pressed to the polished wooden railing. Inside her chest, a fire raged, not of fear, but of furious, measured defiance. Sergeant Whitmore had no idea the magnitude of the mistake he had just made. What he didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Camille Lawson wasn't just any federal agent. She was the lead investigator in an undercover probe into police corruption that would expose a network of rot reaching into every level of the St. Louis Police Department, a network that included Sergeant Travis Whitmore himself. At that very moment, lying on the ground beside her briefcase, sat a slim brown leather file containing a USB drive. Inside that drive was the death warrant for the corrupt careers of a dozen men like Whitmore. Recordings, videos, sworn testimonies. Whitmore yanked Camille upright roughly. "Where did you steal this badge from?" he sneered for the crowd to hear, shaking the credentials like a trophy. Laughter trickled from a few officers lingering near the checkpoint, but the assembled spectators, the attorneys, clerks, and even the defendants, remained deathly quiet. The weight of what they were witnessing seemed to press the very air thinner. Camille, calm even now, turned her head slightly and said, so quietly only Whitmore could hear, "You just destroyed your own life." He laughed, an ugly, barking sound, and shoved her toward a holding room. But the truth is a force more relentless than any pair of handcuffs. Inside the cold, cramped detention room, Camille sat with her hands resting stiffly in her lap. The red marks on her wrists throbbed, but she ignored them. A young, nervous officer, Officer Matt O'Connor, brought her a cup of water, his mouth mumbling something like an apology. She stared through him. Compassion wouldn't save anyone today. Only justice would. Outside, the courthouse buzzed. Someone had captured Whitmore's assault on their phone. Photos were already flooding social media. Videos circulated. News anchors whispered urgently into cameras outside the courthouse steps. The judge had called a recess, but the court officials weren't fools. Everyone knew what was really happening. The woman meant to testify had been publicly humiliated by the very system she came to dismantle. But Camille was not one to retreat. When she re-entered the courtroom, the atmosphere had transformed. Gone was the casual arrogance of the morning. In its place was a thick, electric tension. Cell phones aimed like silent weapons toward the front. Every eye followed her as she walked steadily to the witness stand. She set down her briefcase, opened it slowly, and withdrew the USB drive. "My name is Camille Lawson," she began, her voice clear, each syllable slicing through the stillness. "I am a senior special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. For the past 7 months, I have led an undercover investigation into systematic misconduct within the St. Louis Police Department." She plugged the USB into the court's projector system. The screen came to life. Video footage played, blurry at first, then sharpened. It showed a back alley behind the 12th Street precinct. Whitmore's unmistakable voice filled the courtroom, ordering false charges against an innocent young black man. The man's mother, seated in the gallery, clutched her chest, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. Camille continued relentlessly. I have in my possession 12 additional recordings demonstrating similar misconduct, she stated. In each case, the victims were young black citizens arrested without cause. The charges were dismissed for lack of evidence. The pattern is clear. The intent is undeniable. At the defense table, Whitmore's face drained of color. He whispered furiously to his attorney. His shoulders sagged visibly. But Camille was not finished. When the prosecutor asked if she could identify the officer who had physically intimidated her just that morning, Camille answered without hesitation. Sergeant Travis Whitmore. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge, his mouth a tight line, leaned forward. The same Sergeant Whitmore involved in this morning's incident? Yes, Your Honor, Camille said firmly. Which is why I respectfully request that the remainder of my testimony be protected under federal privilege. I believe my personal safety is now at risk. The judge agreed without hesitation. From that moment on, Travis Whitmore ceased to be a man in uniform. He became evidence, a name on a list, a voice on a tape, a symbol of everything wrong. The next morning, the courthouse steps overflowed with reporters, national news outlets, activist groups, curious citizens. Camille returned, her same tailored suit a silent declaration of resolve. Whitmore shuffled inside, disheveled, chewing nervously on gum, stripped of any pretense of authority. When the court session resumed, Camille stood once more before the court. This morning, I filed an emergency motion, she announced, authorized by my FBI supervisor. She held up a second USB drive marked with red tape. This device contains 26 minutes of recorded conversation from a confidential source directly under Whitmore's command, detailing orders to alter reports, intimidate subordinates, and silence citizens through coercion. When the recording began to play, Whitmore's voice filled the room once more. I'm untouchable, he bragged. I have the whole system in my pocket. The silence afterward was absolute. Camille faced him squarely. Officer Whitmore, would you care to explain those remarks to the court? She asked, voice low, even. Whitmore exploded to his feet. This is a setup. A lie, he bellowed. But it was too late. The judge leaned forward. Sergeant Whitmore, you are hereby placed under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to interfere with a federal investigation. The cuffs that snapped shut around Whitmore's wrists were a perfect, ironic echo of those he had so carelessly used against Camille. As he passed by her, Camille leaned in, just enough for him to hear. You thought you could bury the truth. You only buried yourself. But Camille's journey didn't end there. Her testimony sparked an avalanche. Investigations were reopened. Officers who had long abused their power without consequence were suddenly facing accountability. Working alongside her trusted attorney, Grace Moreno, and a remorseful former officer, Peter Chavez, Camille pulled apart the corrupt network thread by thread. In the process, they uncovered an old case, the supposed suicide of a young black officer who had tried to report misconduct. His death was ruled accidental. Camille's team proved it was murder. That revelation rocked the justice system to its foundations. Reforms swept through the department. Policies were rewritten. Whistleblower protections were fortified. Whitmore, convicted on multiple counts, sat in prison, a symbol of arrogance toppled by truth. Camille, promoted to Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, used her newfound authority to train the next generation of agents who understood that silence is complicity and justice demands vigilance. Years later, sitting in her mother's modest home in Birmingham, Camille thumbed through an old family photo album. Her mother, eyes misty with emotion, touched her hand. Your father would be proud, she whispered. Camille smiled faintly but said nothing. She simply looked out the window, watching the sun blaze against the horizon, thinking of everything it had cost to stand where she stood now. Justice wasn't neat. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't celebrated. It was heavy, relentless work. But it mattered. And that, Camille thought, was enough.